Hi everyone, welcome back to another Thursday Tips and Tricks. We're going to continue on our journey of setting simple blocks on point. And if you recall, last week we talked about cutting the setting triangles that are necessary to be able to build a quilt on point, and the fact that the side setting triangles were cut as quarter square triangles with the straight of the grain here, and the quarter triangles were cut as half square triangles. And I mentioned that you would be building your quilt in diagonal rows, but I thought I'd explore that a little bit more, because at the end of every one of your rows, you will have one of those triangles, either the side setting or the corner setting triangles. And piecing the blocks together, that's easy. You just line up the edges and you go. But when you get to this situation where you're adding a side setting triangle to the end of the row, what you're going to do is line up the 90-degree corner. Both of those have that 90-degree corner, and when you begin to stitch, you're going to stitch from here to here. Don't worry about what happens at the corners. That's one of the reasons that I like to cut my triangles oversized. You simply line up this, stitch out. That will be the triangle that fits on the end of that row. And when you go to attach a corner triangle to either the end of that row or the end of this row, match the middles. Take this block, or take this triangle, excuse me, find the halfway mark, match it up with the halfway mark on your block, and go ahead and position that on there. Now, when you work with oversized triangles, you are indeed going to have some excess fabric hanging out on the edges. That's okay. That's easy to take care of. I might, before I add this corner triangle, decide to just come back with my rotary cutter and straighten that out so that I've got a straight edge and I can sew from edge to edge. And when I do that, and what you'll notice is the edges, they don't all necessarily match. That, again, is a planned attack on my end, because that little bit of extra wiggle room is going to give me some choices when I go to clean up those edges. I can either decide to float them, or I can decide to trim them to precision. And some of that decision will happen depending on what I'm thinking about for borders, because this is a simple project. I don't have a pattern for it. I get to make it up, which is kind of cool. And we'll talk more about borders next week, but some of the options that I'll have for borders is a simple border. Just put a simple, I might have one on the inside and then a dark one on the outside. Possibly, I might consider doing borders that are simple, but they're made with scrappy fabrics. I've got a lot of those still in my pile of fabrics here, and I might decide to do that, or I might actually decide to take those leftover triangles that happened when I cut those piecing triangles, cut those triangles and pieces from my scrap pile into 2.5-inch squares in this case, and we'll talk more about that next week, and turn this quilt into something that's really a wow project by putting a piece border on there. So thinking ahead will determine what it is that I do for the trim down. And I'm not sure what I'm going to do. The simple borders can go either way, but if I'm doing a piece border on this, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to trim it exactly 1/4 inch from the edge. So give me a second. Let me pull this off the wall, and we're going to come over here to the mat, and I'm going to show you what I look at when I go to do the trimming. Now, when I do this, I use my big tools. I use a big square for trimming up the corner so I get that nice and straight, and I use my long 24-inch rulers, and I'm using the 1/4 inch lines that are on my tools. The 1/4 inch line at the edge, at the seam intersection. If I wanted to float it, I could go all the way out to maybe a 1/2 inch mark for floating. But remember, I said I'm not quite sure which border choice I'm going to use, so I'm going to trim this to precision. And I'm looking at the 1/4 inch line here. I'm looking at the 1/4 inch line here. And when I use my Tucker trimmer, I also have this diagonal running through here that helps me align that corner. And I would trim up and trim across just a little bit beyond the actual seam intersections. And when I go to continue down or continue across, I would simply move the quilt so it's more on the mat. Find, and I use a tool that has printed 1/4 inch marks, line those up so that the 1/4 inch line, the 1/4 inch mark on the ruler is on the seam intersection, and continue on with my trimming. And so that's what I'm going to do this weekend. I'm going to finish those last couple of rows. I'm going to add them to this quilt, and I'm going to come back and clean up all the edges so that they are cut a 1/4 inch away from the edge. And then next week, we'll talk about borders. We'll talk about simple versus scrappy versus pieced. So join me next week. Have a great one. See you, everybody.